War is chaos. Smoke, fire, explosions, and fear. Every second can mean life or death. But imagine being in the middle of that madness, and suddenly, seeing something otherworldly. Not enemy soldiers, not tanks, but angels. Yes, real soldiers during World War II claimed they saw angels appear in the sky, protecting them, guiding them, and even turning the tide of battles. It sounds unbelievable. But these weren't just random hallucinations. These were multiple soldiers from different sides of the war, describing almost the same thing. Tall glowing figures. Wings of light. A calming voice in the middle of chaos. So what really happened? Were these just tricks of the mind, or something truly supernatural? To understand this, we have to go back to the very front lines of World War II. Picture the Battle of Britain 1940. The skies over England are burning. British pilots, exhausted, outnumbered, and barely holding on, fight wave after wave of German bombers. Some of them, after surviving impossible missions, reported something strange. One pilot said he saw a figure of light flying beside his plane, keeping pace with him even as bullets ripped through the air. Another claimed that a bright, winged being appeared just before his engines, which had been damaged, miraculously restarted. At first, the military dismissed these stories as stress or exhaustion. But then, more accounts started to appear, not just from the British but also from American, German, and even Russian soldiers. In different countries on different battlefields, the same type of vision. Angels appearing in the heat of battle. Here's an interesting fact. During both World Wars there was a rise in reported supernatural sightings among troops. Psychologists later noted that extreme fear and stress can cause something called battlefield hallucination, where the brain, under intense pressure, creates comforting or symbolic visions. It's the mind's way of trying to protect itself from trauma. But that explanation doesn't fully convince everyone, especially when entire groups of soldiers claim to see the same thing at the same time. Take for example the reports from the Battle of Mons in World War I, a story so famous it became known as the Angels of Mons. British soldiers claimed that angelic warriors appeared in the sky, shielding them from German bullets and helping them escape certain death. The story spread like wildfire across newspapers, churches, and even military briefings. When World War II began, many soldiers grew up hearing that story, and some believed that angels might return again to protect them. Now here's where things get even more fascinating. In 1944, during the invasion of Normandy, an American soldier swore he saw a tall, glowing man on the beach, waving him to cover just seconds before a bomb exploded nearby. When the soldier looked back, the man had vanished without a trace. He later described the figure as having a calm face and shining eyes, and said he felt an overwhelming sense of peace before the chaos resumed. So, were these just coincidences? Or did something divine, really intervene in one of humanity's darkest hours? As the war dragged on, these stories spread among troops like wildfire. They boosted morale. Soldiers whispered about them in trenches, saying maybe, just maybe, they weren't fighting alone. But behind the rumors, scientists and psychologists began digging deeper. Could there be a scientific explanation behind these visions of light and wings? Or was this something that science simply couldn't explain? When you think about soldiers seeing angels on the battlefield, it's easy to imagine it as pure faith or fantasy. But here's the truth. Science actually has something to say about it. And what researchers discovered might surprise you. During World War II, doctors and psychologists began to study what they called combat stress reactions. These were intense mental and emotional experiences soldiers had after facing days, or even weeks, of constant danger. Many troops slept only a few hours a night, ate very little, and lived surrounded by death. In that state, the brain begins to behave differently. It can blur the line between what's real and what's imagined. One U.S. military psychologist in 1943 wrote that some soldiers reported hearing voices or seeing figures right before major battles. He described it as the mind-creating guardians, visual symbols of hope when the body and spirit were pushed to the edge. It wasn't madness. It was survival. But that's not the whole story. Some sightings were collective, multiple soldiers witnessing the same vision at the same time. That's where things get truly strange. How can several people share the same hallucination? Here's one fascinating theory. It's called mass psychogenic experience. Basically, it happens when a group of people, under intense stress, share a powerful belief or fear that shapes their perceptions in the same way. In other words, if a squad of soldiers deeply believe that divine forces might protect them, their minds could interpret lights, smoke, or even gunfire flashes as angelic forms. And under the right emotional conditions, everyone sees the same miracle. Here's an interesting fact. Historians found that during the Battle of Bastogne in the winter of 1944, some American troops reported seeing glowing figures in the snow after artillery shells burst nearby. Later, scientists discovered that phosphorus particles from exploding shells can glow faintly in darkness, especially in foggy or snowy conditions. To a frightened soldier in near-death conditions, that eerie glow could easily look like something supernatural. But not every sighting can be explained so easily. In one report from the Pacific Theater, a Japanese soldier wrote in his diary that he saw a figure made of light, leading wounded men out of a burning bunker. After the war, U.S. troops who read that diary realized that on the same night, American soldiers had reported seeing the exact same figure from the opposite side of the battlefield. Both sides described it the same way, tall, radiant, and silent. No one ever figured out what it was. Stories like these fascinated people back home. Newspapers, magazines, and even church leaders began to use them as symbols of hope. They claimed the angels were proof that something divine was watching over the innocent in a world gone mad. Soldiers began carrying small religious icons or charms, hoping to attract angelic protection. Even generals noticed that morale improved when these stories spread through the ranks. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Some military historians later argued that governments might have quietly encouraged these supernatural rumors to keep soldiers' spirits high. In other words, the angel stories might not just have been personal visions, they could have been used as psychological warfare. Imagine it. You're a soldier, terrified and hopeless, but you hear that angels appeared to your comrades on the front lines. Suddenly you feel stronger. You believe survival is possible. That belief alone can make a difference between courage and collapse. So was it all a clever morale-boosting tactic? Or did something truly beyond human understanding visit the battlefields of World War II? The deeper you look, the stranger it gets. Because as researchers studied more war diaries and letters, they found similar accounts not only in Europe, but in Africa, Asia, and even the oceans. And some of them can't be explained by psychology or propaganda at all. By the middle of World War II, stories of angels appearing on the battlefield had become so widespread that even military intelligence couldn't ignore them. Letters, field reports, and diary entries poured in from soldiers across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. Most were dismissed as superstition or stress. But a few were so detailed, so consistent, that even hardened skeptics couldn't explain them away. One of the most famous came from Italy, 1943, during the brutal battles near Monte Cassino. British and Polish troops were trapped under relentless artillery fire. According to several witnesses, a sudden silence fell over the battlefield. The smoke cleared just enough for soldiers to see a massive figure of light standing atop the ruins of an old church. It glowed faintly as if made of mist and fire. Some swore they heard a calm voice saying, "You will live." Moments later, the shelling stopped. When they advanced, the enemy positions had been abandoned. To this day, survivors from that battle, men who were later interviewed in old age, swore the figure saved them. Here's an interesting fact. After the war, one of the chaplains who served at Monte Cassino told the BBC that more than a dozen soldiers from different units described seeing the same apparition independently. Their testimonies matched almost word for word. And it wasn't just the Allied side. In 1945, near the end of the war, a captured German officer told British interrogators something chilling. He said that in the final days of the Reich, when his men were surrounded by Allied forces, several of them claimed to see a woman in white walking calmly through a destroyed street in Berlin. She was untouched by bullets, unbothered by explosions, and seemed to vanish whenever anyone tried to approach. The officer said that his men dropped their weapons, believing they had seen an angel of death. Some historians later compared this to old European legends of spirit guardians who appear before great tragedy. Another story surfaced from the Pacific Islands, where conditions were unlike anything soldiers had ever faced: jungles, humidity, disease, and constant fear. In 1944, a group of U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal reported that during a nighttime ambush, they saw what looked like a giant bird of light hovering above their camp. At first they thought it was a flare. But the light didn't fall, it moved gracefully, silently, almost intelligently. Moments later, Japanese troops attacked from the forest. The Marines claimed the strange light drifted toward the attackers before disappearing, and the assault stopped almost instantly. Decades later, scientists who studied the report tried to find natural explanations, maybe a meteor or a bioluminescent phenomenon. But none fit the description. No sound. No smoke trail. No logical source. Just a bright, winged shape that appeared when death was near. Then there's the Ardennes winter of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. In the freezing forest, Surrounded and running low on ammunition, an American unit radioed headquarters to report an unidentified friendly figure guiding wounded men toward safety. The report was logged and later marked classified. When it was declassified in the 1970s, researchers were stunned. Multiple soldiers had signed the same statement. They saw a tall man in bright light carrying no weapon who showed them a hidden path through the woods. When rescue teams returned to the same area the next day, there were no footprints. Nothing at all. These stories left experts divided. Were they mass hallucinations born from desperation? Or moments where something truly beyond explanation touched the human world? One historian who studied these accounts put it this way: when humans are closest to death, they often report seeing the same thing: light, warmth, and peace. But during war, these visions didn't just comfort individuals. They seemed to intervene. And that's what makes this mystery so powerful. Because no matter how advanced science becomes, there's still something about human experience, about faith, fear, and hope, that refuses to fit neatly into logic. For the soldiers who saw them, those angels were real. And maybe, just maybe, belief itself gave them the power to survive. By 1944, the war had consumed the world. Entire cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and soldiers were reaching the breaking point. But even as hope seemed lost, stories of angels kept resurfacing, and spreading faster than ever. They appeared in letters, newspapers, and even military broadcasts. For some, these stories were miracles. For others, they were a weapon of psychology. When historians later examined wartime media archives, they found something fascinating. Both Allied and Axis powers quietly encouraged the spread of supernatural stories. The British government, for instance, allowed newspapers to print articles about guardian angels protecting troops, even when the military knew the stories couldn't be verified. Why? Because morale was everything. A soldier who believed angels were watching over him would fight harder, longer, and with more courage. Belief itself became a secret weapon. Here's an interesting fact. In 1940, the British Ministry of Information actually approved pamphlets describing the shining protectors of the skies, referring to the mysterious lights pilots claimed to see during air raids. Those pamphlets were distributed among bomber crews to boost spirits during the darkest months of the war. And it worked. Reports show that morale in those units improved dramatically after the stories spread. The Germans, too, had their own versions. Nazi propaganda often twisted spiritual imagery into something political, claiming that ancestors or Aryan spirits watched over their soldiers. They took the mystery of angels and rebranded it into national mythology. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church and other religious organizations worldwide began speaking publicly about these sightings, calling them signs of divine mercy. Priests in England, America, and Poland gave sermons saying that heaven itself was intervening to protect the innocent. For many soldiers, this gave the war a new meaning. It wasn't just a fight for survival, it became a spiritual struggle between good and evil. When men heard that others had seen angels, it gave them hope that their suffering wasn't meaningless. It made them feel part of a greater purpose. And sometimes, that belief was enough to keep them alive. But behind the scenes, not everyone was convinced. In the years after the war, declassified documents revealed that intelligence agencies had carefully monitored angel reports. Some feared that widespread belief in supernatural forces could lead to panic or religious extremism. Others wondered if these visions could be explained by something more earthly, maybe secret weapons, strange weather patterns, or psychological manipulation. One recently uncovered file from 1945 described Allied pilots over Europe who reported seeing balls of light following their aircraft. The U.S. Air Force gave them a name, Foo Fighters. At first, they thought they were new Nazi weapons. But no technology could explain the glowing orbs that danced around planes, changed direction instantly, and vanished without a trace. To many pilots, they were proof that angels were real, watching from the skies. After the war, some scientists proposed that these lights were caused by electrical discharges in the atmosphere, something like St. Elmo's fire. But even decades later, those who saw them never accepted that explanation. To them, it wasn't just physics, it was something greater. By the late 1940s, the legend of angels of war had become part of popular culture. Books, films, and radio dramas retold the stories of glowing figures saving soldiers from death. People wanted to believe that in the darkest moments of humanity, there was still something pure, something divine, that refused to abandon us. But there was still one question that no one could answer. If these visions were just imagination, why did they appear in almost every war, across cultures, religions, and continents, long before World War II ever began? Because if angels only exist in the mind, How do we explain centuries of identical sightings by people who never met each other? And as the Cold War began, the mystery didn't end, it evolved. Some researchers started connecting the angels of war to modern UFO encounters, suggesting that what soldiers saw might not have been heavenly at all, but something else entirely. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world began to rebuild. But for the soldiers who survived, the memories never faded. Many carried physical scars, others carried something deeper. They couldn't forget what they had seen: glowing figures in the smoke, voices in the chaos, and the feeling that something greater had stood beside them when death was near. For decades, veterans shared these stories quietly, in church halls, hospital wards, and family dinners. At first, few believed them. But as time passed, historians and researchers started collecting their accounts, realizing how widespread these visions really were. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific, the pattern was the same: soldiers on the edge of life and death reporting sights of light, peace, and protection. One fascinating fact: the Imperial War Museum in London holds several handwritten letters from British soldiers describing beings of pure light, who appeared during air raids or fierce battles. None of these letters were meant for publication. They were private messages home, written by men who had nothing to gain by lying. The tone is calm, honest, and hauntingly consistent. Psychologists who studied these letters decades later noticed something profound. Even if the angels weren't real in a physical sense, the impact they had was undeniable. Men who believed they'd seen something divine often recovered faster from trauma. They described feeling watched over, forgiven, or chosen for survival. Faith, real or imagined, became their shield long after the war ended. But others weren't so sure it was just faith. Some veterans claimed that the memories were too vivid to dismiss. They remembered the brightness of the figures, the warmth of their presence, even the shadows they cast. One American paratrooper who fought in Normandy told a journalist in 1962, "I don't care what science says. I saw someone there. He told me to move. I moved, and a second later my whole unit was gone." He never doubted it for the rest of his life. Modern researchers still debate what these soldiers truly saw. Some point to psychological survival mechanisms, how the human brain creates symbols of hope in moments of extreme fear. Others look at natural explanations like light reflections, chemical flares, or atmospheric effects. But a small group of historians, theologians, and even UFO researchers suggest another possibility: that these angels may represent encounters with something beyond our current understanding. Not heavenly, not alien, but unknown. Here's a little-known story. In 1993, a British war historian interviewed a 92-year-old veteran who had served at Monte Cassino. When asked if he still believed in the angel he saw, the old man smiled and said, "I don't know what it was, but I know it was real. You don't forget that kind of light." Then he added something unforgettable: "Maybe heaven doesn't always stay in heaven. Maybe sometimes it comes down to remind us what we can be." Today, the legend of the angels of war lives on, in museums, in documentaries, and in the hearts of those who believe. For some, it's proof of divine mercy. For others, it's a window into the human mind, how belief can turn terror into courage and despair into hope. But maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. Maybe in humanity's darkest hours, when every shred of reason breaks down, something does answer, whether it's God, the universe, or the unshakable strength of the human spirit. Because when the world was at war and everything seemed lost, soldiers across the globe looked into the fire and saw light.